In 1788, Governor Phillip claimed possession of all of the land in New South Wales in the name of the British Crown. From 1791 through to 1820, successive governors from Phillip through to Macquarie made free grants of Crown land. Emancipated convicts and other small free settlers could apply for 40 acres, more if they had a wife or child. Ultimately, most of those who selected small grants were unsuccessful, probably because of a lack of capital. Often there was also a lack of skill or suitability for farming. These grants were foreclosed or sold for rum, and thus ended up in the hands of larger landowners. From 1821 to 1831, applicants for free grants of land had to show evidence of capital, that is to say, that they had money in the bank. But the result of this system was that the poor, mostly ex-convicts, were denied access to land, while simultaneously much of the best land in the colony was being given away to well-to-do settlers, including virtually the whole of the fertile Hunter Valley. The fault was recognised, and a new system for selling land was phased in from 1825 through to 1831. After 1831, all Crown land was sold at public auction. It was just at the point of systemic change in 1831 that the land around West Head was selected by a young Irish immigrant, Alexander Stewart Waddell. Waddell claimed to have capital sufficient to qualify for the grant, but suspicions about just whose capital it really was saw the grant reduced from the 2,560 acres applied for to just 640 acres, or 1 square mile. This surveyor's field book, dated 1832, shows Waddell's selection, along with several others in Pittwater. As it happens, Waddell never took his selection up, and after he left the colony, it was instead granted to the pastoralist William Lawson of Blue Mountains crossing fame. The deed to Waddell's land, as issued to Lawson in 1834, described it as commencing at a marked tree north of Great Mackerel Beach and near West Head, and bounded on the south by a line west, 140 chains to Broken Bay, and on the west and north by the waters of that bay, back to the marked tree aforesaid. The marked tree was close to what was later named Resolute Beach, the place where Governor Phillip had first landed in Pittwater. In order to guide shipping, a signal lamp had been displayed on top of Barrenjoey Headland since 1855, but by 1867, with more than 500 vessels now anchoring in Broken Bay each year, there was a need for something better. The Royal Navy commenced a survey of Broken Bay, in part to determine the best place on which to position a new beacon. Elliot Island, known today as Lion Island, was decided upon because from there a light could be seen not just from out to sea, but upriver and into Pittwater as well. However, government economies would see dual beacons placed instead on Barrenjoey in the form of the 2 Stewart Towers. These would suffice until 1881, when the sandstone lighthouse that still stands today began operating. The chart of the survey was published by the Royal Navy in 1868. It named the land separating Pittwater from Cowan as the Lambert Peninsula in honour of Commodore Rowley Lambert, the then Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy's Australia Station. The Australia Station was the local naval command of the day. Challenger Head, on the western side of the Lambert Peninsula, was named after the Commodore's flagship, HMS Challenger. The elevated land towards the peninsula's northern tip was separately labelled Commodore Heights. Over time, Commodore Heights would gradually become an alternative name for the Lawson grant. When William Lawson died in 1850, he died one of the wealthiest men in the colony. His various estates, including Commodore Heights, totalled more than 85,000 acres. These lands were to be held in trust for the benefit of his surviving children and grandchildren. Commodore Heights, the Lawson grant, went to his daughter Rebecca Bennington, who left it untouched. But when Lawson's grandchildren finally gained their inheritance upon Rebecca's death in 1882, they quickly began to sell off the various lands their grandfather had accumulated. But Commodore Heights lacking road access and isolated from the sea by towering cliffs, would prove difficult to dispose of. Prior to Federation, 5 of the 6 self-governing Australian colonies operated their own colonial navies. New South Wales' first ship was the Wolverine, a Royal Navy screw corvette that was gifted to the government in 1882 for use as a training ship. This photograph shows boy recruits of the New South Wales Naval Brigade at cutlass practice. Throughout the 1880s, the British government and the various Australian colonial governments observed with a measure of anxiety French and German expansion into the Pacific. In February 1883, the Sydney Morning Herald summarised an article lifted from a German newspaper foretelling of a German annexation of New Guinea. It considered Australian neglect of the island justification sufficient for the creation of what it termed a German Java. The article caused a sensation, not just in New South Wales, but over the border in the colony of Queensland, where the shipping lanes of Torres Strait and the Beche de Mer trade were of commercial significance. In November 1884, the German flag was hoisted over New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago and the German Solomon Islands. A vocal and increasingly patriotic Australian public was demanding some sort of action from their governments. Throughout 1884, the siege of Khartoum and the plight of the popular General Gordon excited great concern in both Britain and Australia. News of the slaughter of the entire garrison, General Gordon included, in January 1885 saw Britain accept an offer of troops made by the New South Wales government. The departure in March of the Sudan contingent was seen as an historic occasion, the first time that paid soldiers of an Australian colony had been sent to fight overseas. There was much public fanfare, generated in part by a holiday declared to farewell the troops. It was described as the most festive occasion in the colony's history. As history would have it, the departure of the troops served no military purpose other than to further heighten public awareness of the defenceless state of the Australian colonies. The various railway systems of the rapidly developing Australian colonies became connected to each other, albeit with different gauges, during the 1880s. New South Wales to Victoria in 1883 and Victoria to South Australia in 1887. The Queensland and New South Wales systems met in 1888, but to the immediate north of Sydney the line was broken at the Hawkesbury River. Passengers and goods instead had to unload at a platform on Long Island, where they boarded a double-decker paddle-wheel steamer named the General Gordon. They were then conveyed out into Broken Bay and up into Brisbane Water to Gosford, where they rejoined trains headed north. Construction of a bridge across the Hawkesbury commenced in 1886, with an American company awarded the contract. The spans were assembled on Danga Island and floated 1,500 metres across to the bridge site on barges. It would be the first bridge in Australia built to American lightweight design principles. Previous bridges had been built in wrought iron. There were notable challenges. With 7 spans of 127 metres each and a total length of 890 metres, it would be the 4th largest bridge in the world. It also had the deepest bridge footing in the world at 56 metres. The piers consisted of concrete below the water with sandstone masonry above. It was the longest bridge in Australia, and it pushed bridge design and construction techniques to the limit. When it officially opened on the 1st of May 1889, a continuous railway stretched from Adelaide to Brisbane, a distance of almost 3,000 kilometres. In March of 1885, the Lands Department started surveying a line of road running from Terry Hills to the southern boundary of Commodore Heights. It more or less followed the road that exists today. Why the road was needed wasn't immediately clear, though fear of invasion had surfaced periodically since the withdrawal of British land forces in 1870. The Lambert Peninsula was not regarded as strategically important. The real reason emerged the following year in the form of a planned subdivision into 470 5-acre lots. These lots were all linked, on paper, by roads that ran in admirably straight lines over the rugged terrain to terminate at the cliff edge, though some appeared to plunge over in order to reach the water. As it happens, no road was constructed and no subdivision took place, for there soon began a chain of events that would change the whole complexion of the Lambert Peninsula, including Commodore Heights. In 1887, The New South Wales colonial government requested expert defence advice from the mother country. Britain's Major General Shaw subsequently spent 3 weeks inspecting Sydney's coastal defences. He reported to Parliament in regard to Broken Bay that although the possibility was remote, a hostile fleet, finding the defences of Port Jackson and Botany Bay too strong for them, might be induced to enter Broken Bay with the view of landing troops there. Shaw also realised that the almost completed Hawkesbury River Bridge was an important military target. Defending it would require a battery of at least 2 80-pound guns, and at time of war, an additional 2 gunboats and 2 torpedo boats would have to be stationed nearby. As for Pittwater, General Shaw considered its defence would require 4 9-inch howitzers, 3 8-inch barrel-loading guns, 4 6-inch barrel-loading guns, 2 quick-firing Hotchkiss naval guns, and 4 rifle-calibre guns, all supported by a garrison of 150 engineers and infantry with naval accessories. Unsurprisingly, the extraordinary cost, coupled with a more realistic assessment of the threat, saw the New South Wales Parliament shelve the proposals. By the late 19th century, Pittwater had become a genteel playground for the wealthy. New coach and ferry services brought picnickers and campers to popular spots like the Basin. Large steamers also offered excursions on the waterways. Eccleston Dufour, a member of the Royal Society, patron of the arts and sciences in general, and a conservationist, had become enamoured of the area around Cowan Creek on the western side of the Lambert Peninsula. Disgusted at the depredation of native plants by Sydney flower sellers, he lobbied for the creation of a public reserve to Sydney's north, similar to that recently proclaimed to the south, the Royal National Park. This resulted in the gazetting of Kuringai Chase in 1894, an area of 35,300 acres that included most of the Lambert Peninsula. Hunting and fishing were prohibited altogether, and the natural and Aboriginal-made features of the park were afforded strong protection, on paper at least. But creation of the chase only served to further isolate Commodore Heights, which still remained in private ownership. Prior to Federation in 1901, units of men from all 6 Australian colonies had supported Britain in the Boer War. When Britain asked for more troops in early 1902, the Australian government obliged with a national contingent. But the Anglo-Japanese alliance of that same year saw Britain withdraw its capital ships from the Pacific, thus leaving Australia practically undefended. Then, in 1905, Japan emerged as a major power after it destroyed much of the Russian navy in the Battle of Tsushima. Australians now saw themselves a lonely, sparsely populated outpost that was, perhaps, ripe for the taking. To counter this, Prime Minister Alfred Deakin invited the so-called Great White Fleet, 16 white-painted battleships belonging to the United States, to visit Australia. The visit was enormously successful and led ultimately to the formation of the Royal Australian Navy in 1913. Upon declaration of the European War in 1914, Australia, New Zealand and Japan, for Japan was then an ally, moved quickly to seize all of Germany's possessions in the Southwest Pacific. In 1920, at the Paris Peace Conference that followed the war, Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes sought to permanently secure possession of New Guinea from the defeated German Empire, telling the conference that, strategically, the Northern Islands encompass Australia like fortresses. They are as necessary to Australia as water to a city. Great Britain was subsequently granted a mandate over New Guinea on behalf of Australia. But the League of Nations also granted Japan a mandate, despite Australian reluctance, over the Marshall and Caroline Islands to the immediate north of New Guinea. The implication of this was that the limits of Australian and Japanese territory were now just 285 miles apart, and the inevitable result was that fear of Japan would gradually come to dominate Australian foreign policy. It wasn't until 1924 that the last surviving trustee of Lawson's estate managed to finally rid the family of Commodore Heights. It passed into the hands of would-be developers Miller and Mobbs for the sum of £1,550. Their plan was to subdivide it into waterfront sites where purchasers could erect their weekend villas. Led by surveyor Sidney Stokes, the developers then campaigned for a public road to be built to Commodore Heights. With the support of Kuringai Council, land was resumed from the Chase in 1927 and construction of a road begun. Flushed with success, Stokes, acting through Miller and Mobbs, applied to have Commodore Heights converted to Torrens title. The Riviera Cooperative Country Club was then established in 1931, the proposal being subdivision of the estate into 250 residential lots with a golf course, casino and other resort facilities. A glowing prospectus was issued, but with the country firmly in the grip of the Great Depression, there were no takers. But all that glitters is not gold, and eventually Stokes had to concede defeat. He defaulted on his mortgage and left the problem in the hands of his mortgagees. Their sole intention was now to be rid of it, and in April 1939 they finally managed to sell the land to a Sydney real estate agent who quickly on-sold it the following month. Whereas World War I had bypassed Pittwater with scarcely a ripple, there were deep concerns about Japanese intentions as the 1930s drew to a close. Since the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the Japanese army had modelled itself upon that of Germany. Its officers, always chauvinist, were now imbued with Nazi ideas and had steadily increased the army's political power. Moderate influences in Japanese policy were being overcome by a wave of assassinations. National expansion was glorified and raised to religious duty. The Japanese Navy was different, for its traditions were formed on the British model, but there was a change in its attitude after 1935. Angered by limitations imposed by naval treaties and inspired by the acquisition of the mandated Pacific Islands, the Navy began to see wider horizons beckoning it on. In Australia, those more sanguine viewed the much-hyped British fortress on Singapore Island as proof against Japanese expansionism. But others noted that Japan now had the third largest navy in the world, and the huge base at Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands was within striking distance of the Australian mainland. Following Japan's invasion of China in 1937, the slogan "No scrap for the Jap" began to appear on wharves around the country. Sydney wharfies walked off the Tame and Maru when they learned that scrap iron destined for Japan was on board. They argued that these materials were being used for war purposes against the Chinese civilian population.
Oh, we wouldn't load pig iron for the fascists of Japan. Despite intimidation, we refused to lift the ban. With democracy at stake, the struggle must be won. We had to beat the menace of the fascist rising sun.
Even before war broke out, planning for the defence of Sydney was quietly underway. There was a view that a Japanese invasion would follow the course suggested by General Shaw some 50 years before, and it would involve a naval attack on Pittwater as the gateway to Sydney. In June 1939, it was proposed that 2 4.7-inch guns and 2 searchlights be allocated for the defence of Broken Bay. The battery would be sited at West Head. Barrenjoey was rejected because it could be isolated by a small landing force at Palm Beach. Just days before Australia declared war on Germany, the New South Wales government resumed the whole of Commodore Heights, ostensibly for public recreation. Control was quickly ceded to the Commonwealth for defence purposes, but the New South Wales government was asked to do some of the necessary roadwork to West Head as part of its tourist policy, both to avoid panicking Pittwater locals and to minimise the inevitable claim for compensation.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
Following the declaration of war against Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, there was controversy in Australia. Should we concentrate on forming an overseas service to fight Germany in Europe, or a home defence force to fight Japan? Prime Minister Robert Menzies decided to do both, although the experience of the Great War indicated that Australia did not have the resources to do either. A National Security Act was passed, and a volunteer military force, the 2nd AIF, announced for service at home and abroad. A citizen militia was organised for local defence. The 18th Militia Battalion would defend the coast from Barrenjoey to Narrabeen, the 17th Militia from Narrabeen to Manly. The production of hundreds of miles of defensive barbed wire went into full swing, along with the pouring of thousands of concrete tetrahedrons to block tanks, each of which weighed 2.5 tonnes and stood 5 feet high. Multiple rows of these tetrahedrons lined all the beaches south of Mona Vale. In January of 1940, on the open area at the end of Ruskin Row at Avalon, Nancy Bird Walton, Australia's famous aviatrix, trained the Women's Air Training Corps at the Sundown RAAF camp. Volunteers learned aircraft engine maintenance, ambulance and truck driving, and signalling. At Mona Vale, La Corniche, the extraordinary building better known as Brock's Folly, was also used as a training base. Although the government hoped that half the new AIF would be drawn from the militia, it was soon clear that this would not be achieved. After an initial rush, enlistments quickly tapered off, so that only one division, the 6th, was formed. Most of the 6th arrived in Palestine in June 1940. It took the fall of France in July 1940 to shock both government and people into action. A huge surge of enlistments, almost 50,000 in June 1940, provided enough personnel to fill not only the recently formed 7th Division, but an 8th and 9th as well. Though the track at either end of the Hawkesbury River Railway Bridge was single line, the bridge itself had double tracks. This had led to the undesirable practice of using the bridge as a crossing point for trains operating on this section of line, thus regularly subjecting the structure to maximum stress loads. In 1927 the bridge was strengthened and the practice put an end to. But in 1937 a nasty crack developed in one of the piers. With the war demanding up to 100 trains a day across the bridge, the timing couldn't have been worse. The speed limit on the bridge was revised down to 15 miles per hour, and then to just 5. Work commenced on a new bridge in July 1940, but it wouldn't be completed until after the war had ended. The European War finally reached Australian waters in August 1940, with the German raider Orion sinking a French cargo vessel, Natal, off Noumea. 4 days later, Orion sank a British merchantman, the Turkina, in the Tasman Sea. Further pressure came in the form of the German auxiliary cruiser Penguin. It laid mines between Sydney and Newcastle in late October 1940, as did the Storstad off the Victorian coast. In early November, Storstad mines sank 2 ships off Wilson's Promontory, the Cambridge and the city of Rayville. Closer to home, a Penguin mine sank the freighter Nimbin off Nora Head in early December with the loss of 7 lives. Another claimed the trawler Millie Mulmull off Broken Bay in March 1941. Because of the German raiders, few boats now ventured out to sea from Pittwater. Homes were blacked out at night. Bomb shelters were dug. If more was needed to convince Pittwater residents that the threat was real, the sight of bulldozers carving out an anti-tank ditch from Bungan Head across to Wingy Jimmy on Pittwater should have sufficed. A line of anti-tank defences stretched from the end of Alexandra Crescent at Bayview down to Maybank Cove. From there, rows of concrete tetrahedrons marched eastwards across the mudflats to connect with the barbed wire-filled ditch. There was paranoia too, with suspected sightings of Japanese landing parties and spies reported to be signalling submarines out at sea. Posters were everywhere. They asked for savings to finance the war effort, warned that the enemy listens and that a careless word could sink a ship. They called for men and women to enlist and, for those not enlisted, to work to support the war effort. They were seen in buses and trams and most public places, and above all, they warned with unequivocal imagery of the looming threat of Japan. While the civilian population was coming to terms with wartime life, the military was rushing ahead with arrangements for the installation of the defences of the area, especially the West Fortress battery to be situated at West Head. West Fortress was given 3 tasks: to prevent landing craft entering Pittwater, to similarly prevent such craft from entering Cowan Creek, and to prevent raiding craft seeking to destroy the Hawkesbury River Bridge. For these reasons, it was sited 40 feet above sea level and 100 yards south of the most northern point of West Head. The site chosen was described as a grassed and cleared area of fairly even surface and of sufficient size to comfortably locate the 2 guns, shell stores and shelters for gun crews on duty. The problems of construction were enormous. Hundreds of tons of steel and concrete had to be landed at water level, sometimes in bad weather. Building materials for the engineering and sleeping quarters at the top of West Head Cliff had also to be brought in by water because the road was too poor to cope with the amount of traffic required. The engineers solved this problem by gouging a track down the cliff face to water level and building railway tracks into it. Rails also extended horizontally along the waterfront behind the gun emplacements. At the top of the railway, a powered winch hauled supplies up the 50-degree inclined track to the top. Later, it would be pointed out that they had constructed a perfect ranging and sighting mark for hostile naval guns out to sea. By January 1941, the engineering works were completed. The 93 personnel required to establish the battery were kitted out on the 15th of January 1941.
The interesting thing about the commemoration of the Second World War is that you have to remember that the war in England, in Europe, things like the Battle of Britain were celebrated very openly in the press because they needed to maintain their self-esteem, which was fundamentally important to Britain because they really were under the threat of life and death. In Australia, it was completely different. Everything that they didn't want secrets to get out, and they didn't want to scare the population, and so everything was completely hush-hush, super secret. And therefore, after the war, when everything was dismantled, away went the memories, and so we have very little memory of what actually happened during the war.
Let's go back a little bit to 1940. It's well recorded in 1940 that just over the horizon, not far out, the German Navy was really quite busy, and they were playing havoc in the shipping lanes off the coast. It has been not officially confirmed, but the first ship to be sunk on the Australian coastline during the war was just off Cooktown. And it hit a mine which had been laid by a German auxiliary cruiser by the name of Penguin. Penguin was operating out there, and it had a whole lot of support in a whole lot of merchant vessels, armed merchant ships that were there to give it support and raid the various ships that were going up and down the coast. It was only January of 1940, only about 4 months after war was declared, and the enemy ships were right here, right outside the back door, which indicated that the likelihood of other ships coming was fairly pronounced. And in amongst those other ships that could come were vessels that could be arriving, would be troop ships, for instance. They could come into the bay with specialised troops who would be amphibious troops, if you like. They would be quite at home in boarding landing craft, which would make their way around under the base of Barrenjoey, and come inside. And on the western shore of Pittwater, there's a whole lot of little bays and beaches and things down there, which would be absolutely ideal for a landing. And so that's the sort of thing that occurred. Then the place needed to be protected, and of course the question was then how to go about doing that. It could have occurred in a number of ways. It could be done by ship or whatever, but because of the proximity of this headland to both Lion Island and also to Barrenjoey, the shape of the head itself was absolutely ideal, because it meant that the gunnery placement now can see the whole sweep, Hawkesbury River, right across the bay, over here near Pittwater. It's an ideal place to put an artillery battery. So that decision was made to install then two 4.7-inch guns on this particular site for the purpose of defending the whole of this area. In the meantime, life was going on outside in civilian life, and there were a whole lot of young fellas at that stage who were about 16 and 17. They'd hear the news all the time. The war was just outside there, and if they'd been to a picture theatre on a Saturday night, they'd see a newsreel, and what do they see on the newsreel? All these young fellas about their own age going up the gangplank, getting on board a troop ship, waving their hats like mad with rifles slung over one shoulder and the kit bags on their back, thinking, this is a great adventure, let's go. we fell for the trap because we volunteered. We were taken immediately to the quartermaster store, and we were issued with all the kit that was required to make us a soldier. And when we arrived, the sight that we saw was just breathtaking. The cutting down through the cliff face. The first thought that occurred to us, of course, was how on earth did anybody ever manage to do that? Because right through it, there was a great scar down the cliff face from top to bottom, and had been graded at 50 degrees angle, which is steep. But it went all the way down to the water's edge. And we looked at that and thought, wow. Then the realisation came when we got a little bit closer to that. When we saw the cutting, then we saw inside the cutting were 2 railway lines.
The basis of this is basically a 2-to-1 distance ratio with a 2-to-1 weight ratio. And as you can see, this has got to go twice the distance down to the bottom, as this uses a pulley system. Okay, so this weighs twice as much as that, but this moves twice as far as this one. So I'll just move that down again. So when this is coming up, this will be lighter, and we have a brake shoes on either side of the pulley to slow it down. And on the other way down, this will be heavier, so it naturally travels down with the brakes applied here to slow it down.
Well, that was fine. We began to understand that all right. And he said, well, that's all right, we've done that. Now we've done that, let's go down the cliff face and see what's happened at the bottom. And that was an experience, getting down the cliff face. My goodness me. Something we never even thought of before. But anyway, after a bit of a scramble, we did get down the bottom. And once again, we were astounded by the amount of work that the fortress engineers had done. Because when we arrived there were gun emplacements, there were the battery observation post there, the picket hut was there, horizontal railway line was there. There's all manner of work that had been done by the fortress engineers. It was absolutely incredible, it really was. But that was the infrastructure that we had to be ready for us to arrive. And then Major Garland said, let's go and have a look up the cliff face from the bottom, so you get an idea of just exactly what's in front of you. So off we went, toddled along, and got to the bottom of the cliff face down there, and looked up, and wow. If ever we had any doubt that this was going to be difficult, that dispelled that doubt right away. It was obvious that it was going to be 2 things. It was going to be heavy, and it was going to be hard. And not only that, it was also going to be dangerous.
If you think of the guns that are down at Manly and along towards right through to Botany Bay, they're all mounted at the top of the hill, at the highest points they could possibly put the guns in. The higher you put a coastal gun in, the further range you can get out of it. And so when they decided to fortify this site, you then have to look at what was their task. And their task was to prevent raiding parties using Broken Bay as a point of entry, mainly to protect the Hawkesbury River Bridge, and that was the only bridge that was operational at that time. It was a railway bridge, and all the traffic, all the defence traffic, up to about 100 trains a day, were travelling across that bridge on their way between Melbourne and Brisbane. If we'd lost the bridge, if a party had got there and blown the bridge, that would have disrupted the war effort, and everything would have had to run through Bathurst. And much longer track, a far less developed railway track at that time. The third task was to stop small parties coming into Pittwater and up Cowang Creek, Kuringai Bay in that area, getting up over the plateau and playing merry havoc at the back of North Sydney. So the task wasn't to stop capital ships and large naval vessels getting into Broken Bay. It wasn't even envisaged as a risk. And so instead of big guns, they put 2 4.7-inch guns onto this site. These were old guns. They'd come off merchant ships at the end of World War I. They'd been put into store, they'd been kept very carefully by Navy, and Navy are quite happy to sign them out to Army to bring them up here and to use them again during World War II. But why down there? John Whitelaw was the Colonel Fixed Defences in Sydney. John Whitelaw said, well, I don't want dead water. Now if you have a gun up here and you depress it 5 degrees, it's going to hit the bottom of Barrenjoey. And everything underneath it, from here, from the foreshore here to the point where that round lands, is dead water. Anyone can go up and down there, and you couldn't hit them. So he said, the only way you can stop them coming into this area is to put the guns at the bottom. Army headquarters wrote back and said, we don't agree with you. And he said, well, I'm sorry, but that's where they're going. And he stuck to his guns. and he won that argument on the ground of dead water. And so that's why the guns went down there. That's why these young fellas had to get everything down there and be able to man it. And that's why they built the picket hut down there, because they didn't want people scrambling up and down in the dark if they had to take post. They had to keep enough people down there 24 hours a day so that they could man those guns in an instant. And so therefore they put virtually half the battery down there and half up top and rotated them throughout that period. So
intelligence was coming in to say Broken Bay is in more danger than it had been before. They were then forecasting the arrival of Japanese ships, which had not been counted on beforehand. So the concentration was going to be get one gun operating as quickly as possible. So the effort was really made then to get number 2 up and running. And all the time we were getting more and more intelligence readings saying, you know, the risk is high. Push, 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 make it harder. Tomorrow morning, we were up for breakfast, of course, and did all the usual checks of the ropes and the slings and this and that. And we were sitting having lunch and just about to finish, and the truck came around the corner. And sitting on the back of the truck was the monster. Oh, good Lord. When we looked at it, it was sprawled, that's all I can say, but it was sprawled all over the truck, a little bit over the sides, and it was about 5 foot tall, and it was a sort of a dirty blue, grey, green sort of a colour. It was ominous. We had to get a number of slings and put around the pedestal and connect those to the block and tackle and lift them off the back of the truck. We raised it about 10 centimetres, enough to clear the truck. Truck was driven away, and now of course we have is this 7 tonnes of pedestal sitting on the end of a rope. Next thing was to lower the pedestal onto the rollers. Aha! It's all being supported into place. So we then go to the crowbar, and we were able to persuade the pedestal to move across that distance, across that area, until we got it right to the gantry, where we had to pick it up, put it on the moving platform. We moved the pedestal down, again go back to the block and tackle, lift the pedestal, take away all the timbers, excepting the uprights. Nobody was allowed inside that gun emplacement while that pedestal was hanging just suspended right above us. No way known we'd get in there. However, what we had to do now is take all the pieces of timber away, pick it up with a block and tackle, and then lower it into the gun emplacement, where at the bottom of the gun emplacement where there's a steel face with bolts in it. And the whole idea was that would be dropped into place and that would then be secured. Well, that was fine. Then we took the big piece of timber out. When that was out, the gun deck was laid around, and then what we had to do, of course, the next thing after the pedestal was the gun cradle. And after the gun cradle came the gun, which had the gun and a breech in one piece. And from there on, all the other odds and ends that were required. The sights for the gun layers, the recovery action, which covered the recoil of the gun, all those other various pieces that are required to operate a gun of any kind were there then, so they had to be slowly put into place. So by then, the pressure was really on. And we were battling to get these things running as quickly as we could. It didn't take very long for us to realise, of course, that by now the gun really was getting to the stage within a reasonable time we'd be able to say the gun is now ready. Now, a proving shoot is something that takes place wherever artillery is concerned to make sure, firstly, the gun is accurate, There's no point in having a gun that you just fire it somewhere and hope that it's going to get anywhere near the target. You have to have some sort of guarantee to make sure that the gun has been assembled correctly, because every little movement, every piece you put together, every moving piece you put together, if it is not true, then the end result will be the effect that the shell will not drop exactly where you want it. It's impossible. The gun will be distorted all the time. So first thing, make sure all these things are accurate. It was a great idea every morning for the gun layer to get on the gun and follow the ferry around. And we always used to wonder, what on earth did the skipper or the passengers ever think of to see the 4.7-inch gun following the ferry wherever it went. We wondered what they thought about that. But anyway, time came for the shoot. The gun crew was ready, but mind you, it's all right, it's casual to say, let's have a shoot of a gun, bang, bang. That's not like that. It is a very complex business. Artillery itself is a complex business. What I'd like to do now, I would like to bring back my friend Vic Ray, who I'd like to talk to you again about what's going on in the battery observation post. There's a real flurry of activity. Vic.
But to make the guns work properly, you had to have a battery observation post. Sometimes they would call the people with the cherry club in the mouth by the gunners, but they did a lot of work. There were signallers, there were officers, there were assistants, there were plotters, and there were searchlight operators. This is an unusual observation post. It's a two-level one. So you've got a top level, which the searchlights, which were engineers originally until about 1943, and then they transferred to gunners. But in that original time, the searchlight commanders had the top floor, and they had voice communication to the second level. In the second level, you have an officer who works a depression rangefinder. Now, a depression rangefinder is a telescope with a bearing ring at the bottom and the ability to track a target. So in this position, you could move it right across the face of the water, and you could aim it down and read off the angle of depression from the battery observation post to the target. Go back to your trigonometry. If you put a line straight down to sea level and a line straight out at sea level, you've got a right angle triangle. So therefore the hypotenuse has got to be your range, and that's what's calculated off by the operators who calculate the range. So you've got bearing, you've got range, you've got a battery commander who stands next to him. He's waiting for all the orders to come together. And then on the other side of the battery commander, you have an inclination officer. And it's not because he's inclined to be there or anything like that, but his task is to work out the speed and the angle that the ship is approaching. So that information is calculated out and then goes via the telephone to the loudspeakers in the back of the gun position. And at that information coming out, bearing, range, the angle of offset that allows for the speed of the boat, and that's affected by the things that the inclination officer has reported. You put all those things together, you then are actually, the gun is pointing in front of the ship, so that by the time it fires, the ship and the round come together. And that's the task for the battery observation post. It's not just a matter of sitting at a gun, looking through a sight and aiming at a target. You do that, the target's gone past you. The calculations mean that you actually get both together. So that keeps them busy. The other thing about the searchlights, it's not like New Year's Eve, where the searchlights are all over the sky and all over the bridge. Not at all, because as soon as you turn a searchlight on, someone's going to fire at it. Okay, so the searchlights are blacked out until the battery commander is ready to go to fire. And then he needs the light, not straight away, but when the round is about to hit the target. And so they will order the searchlights 1 exposure 30 seconds, 2 exposure 30 seconds, and then it's black again. And in that time, those 2 rays of lights, the battery commander is supposed to be able to pick up the round and make his correction and adjustments for the next set of rounds of fire.
Thanks, Vic. With all this going on in the background, of course, now the gun crew, of course, is itching now. They begin to feel, well, at least we've got somewhere. We're getting close. So eventually, anyway, the gun crew was around. The gun was loaded. The shell had been loaded. The cordite charge had been loaded. The breech was closed and locked. And the breech operator had, in a true fashion, he had stepped back away a little bit from the gun and raised his right arm to indicate that he was standing clear of the breech, so that he wouldn't be hit as the gun recoiled. And then, of course, what they wait for is the report from the layers, having got all this information. They can lock onto the target. When both layers say on target, then it's all ready to go. The first shot was overshot, which was meant to be. The second one was short. The third one was overshot. The fourth one was short. But the fifth one, of course, had just destroyed the rogue altogether, which it was meant to do, to destroy the target. So yes, we had a pretty good night. We felt at that time, looking back, we had been then in the army probably a couple of days short of 12 weeks. I mean, in that 12 weeks, we had been through all that training we had. We had been through the exercise of putting this gun together and putting this battery together, and here we are at the end. The gun's been fired and it's absolutely spot on. We felt somewhat pleased with ourselves, because we thought in a relatively short space of time, from boys who had known absolutely nothing beforehand, we thought we had done pretty well. I must say that this right now, that's about as much as I say about this story now. To say any more would be repetitive, because all the things that happened in number 2 gun, we did in number 1 gun. And we've just been repeating the same story over and over again. But again, I say, perhaps, on behalf of the 80-odd guys that came here together, as we were then, I thank you for your attendance and your interest in what's happened. Thank you. Oh, you're very kind.
Underneath the lantern by the barrack gate, darling, I remember the way you used to wait. 'Twas there that you whispered tenderly that you loved me, you'd always be my lily of the lamplight, my own Lily Marley. Time would come for roll call, time for us to part. Darling, I'd caress you and press you to my heart. And there, 'neath that far-off lantern light, I'd hold you tight, we'd kiss goodnight, my lily of the lamplight, my own Lily Marley. Orders came for sailing somewhere over there. All confined to barracks was more than I could bear. I knew you were waiting in the street. I heard your feet, but could not meet, my lily of the lamplight, my own Lily Marley. Resting in a billet just behind the line, even though we're parted, your lips are close to mine. You wait where that lantern softly gleams, your sweet face seems to haunt my dreams, my lily of the lamplight, my own Lily Marley. my own Lily Marley.
Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Cheerio, here I go on my way. Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Not a tear, but a cheer, make it gay. Give me a smile I can keep all the while in my heart while I'm away. Till we meet once again, you and I. Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye.
Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Cheerio, here I go on my way. Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Not a tear, but a cheer, make it gay.
Give me a smile I can keep all the while in my